All right, so this week, as we study together, we're going to go back to the weekly Torah portion. And we're going to take a deep dive into this week's Torah portion, which is called Shemini. The portion, Shemini, includes 3 chapters from the book of Leviticus, chapters 9, 10, and 11. And the name of the portion, Shemini, means eighth. It's the number 8 in ordinal form, eighth. The name Shemini comes from the fact that in the previous portion, Aaron and his sons were consecrated, and they were anointed to begin their service as priests in the tabernacle. And that process of consecration took 7 days. So this week's portion comes immediately on the heels of that and tells us what occurred on the 8th day, by Yom HaShemini, on the 8th day. And so we begin this week in Leviticus chapter 9, following that 7-day consecration period. And now it is time to begin performing the ritual sacrifices and all the service that the Lord had prescribed to take place in the tabernacle. Aaron and his sons are finally ready to begin their service as priests in the tabernacle. So in chapter 9 of Leviticus, we see Aaron, and with the assistance of his 2 oldest sons, beginning to carry out those duties. They carry out the instructions that were given by the Lord to Moses earlier in the book of Exodus. And everything we see in chapter 9 is carried out to a T. It's perfect. And at the end of chapter 9 of Leviticus, the glory of the Lord appears to all the people, and a holy fire comes out from before the Lord. It's a consuming fire that consumes the offering, and when the people saw this, they let out a great shout, and they fell on their faces. As chapter 9 concludes, everything is rolling along perfectly according to plan in this newly instituted system of worshiping the Lord in his tabernacle. God is honored and glorified in his house, and his people respond by worshiping him. Everything is good. But then we come to chapter 10. Here in chapter 10, we find an abrupt about face. That new service comes to a screeching halt as something terrible happens. Nadab and Abihu, the 2 eldest sons of Aaron, well, they go off script. And they displease the Lord. And this time, the fire of the Lord comes down and consumes not the offering, but the priests. Nadab and Abihu are dead, right there on the spot, in the tabernacle. It's a tragedy. We also see, as we continue in chapter 10, how that situation is eventually resolved, what is done with their bodies as they try to move forward. We see how Aaron reacts to this horrible scene that is playing out in front of him. His 2 younger sons carry on in the older son's place. The system can resume. And then in chapter 11, there's seemingly a total change of subject, although I would argue that it's not. It switches gears pretty dramatically, and we find a whole host of laws and instructions about the clean and the unclean animals, what is clean to eat, what is not clean to eat. So these are the 3 chapters in our portion this week, chapters 9, 10, and 11 of Leviticus. And those are the major events that we will find in the text. Our study today is going to focus on that middle portion, primarily on chapter 10 and the story of Nadab and Abihu. And as we focus on these two guys, I want to pose and answer 4 questions. So we'll spend the rest of our time this morning on these 4 questions. Number 1, who were Nadab and Abihu? It's a pretty basic question, but it's a good one to ask because it sets the stage for what we're seeing happen. Who were Nadab and Abihu? Number 2, what were they doing that day in the tabernacle? Specifically, what was it that they were doing in the tabernacle the day they died? Number 3, why did they die? What was their offense that was so great that they were struck down dead instantaneously? And number 4, what can we learn from Nadab and Abihu about the character of God and also about the character of man? Now, in that last question, those 2 aspects, what can we learn about the character of God? What can we learn about the character of man? I think it's very useful to examine Scripture through those 2 lenses. In anything we're studying, what is the Lord revealing to me about himself? What is the Lord revealing to me about me? And as I learn these 2 things, how can I use that knowledge to grow closer to the Lord, to align my character more closely to his, that I can be a pleasing aroma in his nostrils and not a source of displeasure? I think that's a good way to approach Scripture in general, and that will be our ultimate takeaway today. What do we learn through Nadab and Abihu and their death in the tabernacle? What do we learn about the character of God and the character of man? And so let's dive into these 4 questions. So question number 1, again, who were Nadab and Abihu? Who were they? Our first question is a pretty simple one. Who were these 2 men? And there are not all that many Scripture references about them prior to the story of their death. So let's just run through everything the Bible tells us about these guys. And the first reference is found in Exodus chapter 6. Exodus 6, verse 23, we read of their birth. It says, "And Aaron took Elisheva, daughter of Amminadab, sister of Naashon, to wife. And she bare him Nadab and Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar." So here we see that Aaron and his wife, Elisheva, had 4 sons. Nadab and Abihu were the 2 eldest of those 4 sons. And of course, if we draw on our kind of basic Bible knowledge, we can deduce that these 2 guys were Levites, right? They were of the house of Levi, because we know that Moses and Aaron both were of the house of Levi. These guys were nephews of Moses, the great prophet. They were sons of Aaron, the eventual high priest. In Exodus 24, Israel was encamped at the base of Mount Sinai, as you will recall, and Moses had already been going up and receiving the law from the Lord and delivering it to the people. And in Exodus 24, we have our next appearance of Nadab and Abihu, when the Lord said to Moses, "Come up unto the Lord thou, and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and worship ye afar off." And again in Exodus 24, 9 through 11, "Then went up Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel." And listen to this. "And they saw the God of Israel, and there was under his feet, as it were, a paved work of sapphire stone, and as it were, the body of heaven in his clearness. And upon the nobles of the children of Israel he laid not his hand. Also they saw God, and did eat and drink." So Nadab and Abihu were in pretty rarefied company. witnessing this glorious sight. Of course, they did not come as close as Moses would up on the mountaintop, but they were granted a certain level of access and nearness to God's presence that not everyone in the greater congregation had. The last reference we have to Nadab and Abihu, specifically by name, prior to their death, is in Exodus chapter 28, verse 1. And take thou unto thee Aaron thy brother, and his sons with him from among the children of Israel, that he may minister unto me in the priest's office, even Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar, Aaron's sons. Nadab and Abihu and their brothers were called to minister as priests alongside their father Aaron. And there were many specific instructions that would follow regarding what they should wear, how they should serve, what they should eat, and when. So our first question was, who were Nadab and Abihu? Well, based on these readings of Scripture, we know that Nadab and Abihu were Levites, nephews of Moses, the two eldest sons of Aaron. They personally witnessed glorious visions of God, partially up Mount Sinai, and they were called to a life of service as priests in the tabernacle. As we will see further in Leviticus, as we saw in Exodus, their call to service came with great blessing. But as we will see in Leviticus, their call also comes with the weight of great responsibility. So let's move on to our second question. Question number 2. What was it that Nadab and Abihu were doing in the tabernacle that day? In Leviticus 9 and also in Leviticus 10. What were Nadab and Abihu doing in the tabernacle? As I said earlier, the chapters that precede our portion, Shemini, detail the ordination service and the 7-day consecration period during which Aaron and his sons were dressed in their holy garments. They were anointed, sacrifices were made, all in accordance with the specific instruction that God had given for that ordination service. Now, on the 8th day, Moses instructs Aaron and his sons to begin offering those sacrifices on behalf of the people. Chapter 9 details those sacrifices on the 8th day. And it's important to note that all the regulations for the offerings they would be bringing, all of the rules and regulations for their priestly duties were given in previous passages from the first several chapters in Leviticus. What that means is that as you read chapter 9, you can go back and match up the offerings they are bringing forth with the regulations for those offerings given previously. Does that make sense? In other words, you can look at what Aaron and Nadab and Abihu were doing, and you can go back and see why they were doing it precisely the way they did it. None of it was random or haphazard, and they certainly should not have been making it up as they went along. So now let's read Leviticus 9. Go ahead and turn there with me because we're going to read the entire chapter, Leviticus chapter 9, and let's examine what Aaron and his sons were doing in the tabernacle. We'll read it in sections, and we'll pause every so often to make some observations. So reading now Leviticus chapter 9, and we're going to read verses 1 through 5. And it came to pass on the 8th day that Moses called Aaron and his sons and the elders of Israel. And he said unto Aaron, Take thee a young calf for a sin offering, and a ram for a burnt offering without blemish, and offer them before the Lord. And unto the children of Israel thou shalt speak, saying, Take ye a kid of the goats for a sin offering, and a calf and a lamb both of the first year without blemish, for a burnt offering. Also a bullock and a ram for peace offerings to sacrifice before the Lord, and a meat offering mingled with oil. For today the Lord will appear unto you. And they brought that which Moses commanded before the tabernacle of the congregation. And all the congregation drew near and stood before the Lord. So, first observation, we see that a number of different types of offerings would be made that day. A sin offering, a burnt offering, both for the priest and then for the people. Peace offerings, and a meat offering, which would be waved before the Lord. All of the animals for these sacrifices were brought forth, and the whole congregation drew near to the tabernacle. So let's continue in verse 6. And the Lord said, This is the thing which the Lord commanded that ye should do. And the glory of the Lord shall appear unto you. And Moses said unto Aaron, Go unto the altar, and offer thy sin offering and thy burnt offering, and make an atonement for thyself and for the people. And offer the offering of the people, and make an atonement for them, as the Lord commanded. Aaron therefore went unto the altar, and slew the calf of the sin offering, which was for himself. And the sons of Aaron brought the blood unto him. And he dipped his finger in the blood, and put it upon the horns of the altar, and poured out the blood at the bottom of the altar. But the fat and the kidneys and the caul above the liver of the sin offering he burnt upon the altar, as the Lord commanded Moses, and the flesh and the hide he burnt with fire without the camp, or outside the camp. So the first of the offerings was the sin offering. When the animal was slain, it was Aaron's sons, including Nadab and Abihu, that gathered that blood. They brought it to their father, and Aaron used his finger to apply blood to the horns of the altar. The rest of the blood was poured out at the base of the brazen altar, and only certain fatty tissues were burned. The rest of the animal was burnt outside the camp. As we read, you'll see that that's specific to the sin offering. Other times, the whole animal is consumed. Next, a burnt offering was made. Continuing in verse 12. And he slew the burnt offering, and Aaron's sons presented unto him the blood, which he sprinkled round about upon the altar. And they presented the burnt offering unto him, with the pieces thereof, and the head, and he burnt them upon the altar. And he did wash the innards and the legs, and burnt them upon the burnt offering on the altar. Notice once again, we see Aaron's sons presenting him the blood. At this time, they also present Aaron the various parts of that slain animal, and the whole animal was burnt in the burnt offering. According to Leviticus 1, where we find the regulations for this offering, it was Aaron's sons who would lay the wood on the brazen altar. And it was Aaron's sons who would lay the pieces, the head and the fat. The entrails and the legs would be washed and then also lain in their place and burnt. As I said earlier, unlike the sin offering, the entire animal was consumed on the altar. These two offerings were for the priests. And now we have the sin offering and another burnt offering made for the people. Reading in verse 15. And he brought the people's offering and took the goat, which was the sin offering for the people, and slew it, and offered it for sin as the first. And he brought the burnt offering and offered it according to the manner. Once again, Aaron's sons working alongside their father, bringing that blood, laying that wood, arranging those pieces on the altar according to all the regulations of each offering. And in verse 17, and he brought the meat offering, and took a handful thereof, and burnt it upon the altar, beside the burnt sacrifice of the morning. He slew also the bullock and the ram for a sacrifice of peace offerings, which was for the people. And Aaron's sons presented unto him the blood, which he sprinkled upon the altar round about, and the fat of the bullock and of the ram, the rump, and that which covereth the inwards, and the kidneys, and the caul above the liver. And they put the fat upon the breasts, and he burnt the fat upon the altar. And the breasts and the right shoulder Aaron waved for a wave offering before the Lord, as Moses commanded. So in the meat offering, only a handful was offered and burnt on the altar. Then the peace offerings were made, which were different from the other offerings. Like the burnt offering, the blood was sprinkled about, and then like the sin offering, the fat of the peace offering was rendered from the animal and was burnt on the altar, because it belonged only to the Lord. But then Aaron took the breasts and the right shoulder of the animal and waved them before God as a wave offering. Again, all throughout the process, Aaron's sons were attending to the blood. They were tending the fire. They were tending to the placement of the parts. And in due time and according to the specific type of offering. My point in reading through all of those offerings is I want you to see there's a precision. I want you to see that there are nuances, and it's important for them to know the nuances and be able to handle each one according to its way. Why? Because God had commanded it. And lastly, we see the result of these offerings as we read the final verses of chapter 9. So reading again, beginning in verse 22, and Aaron lifted up his hand toward the people and blessed them, and came down from offering of the sin offering and the burnt offering and the peace offerings. And Moses and Aaron went into the tabernacle of the congregation and came out and blessed the people. And the glory of the Lord appeared unto all the people. And there came a fire out from before the Lord, and consumed upon the altar the burnt offering and the fat, which when all the people saw, they shouted and fell on their faces. At this point, the Lord was very pleased with the work of Aaron and his sons. And he was pleased with the sacrifices of the people. As I said before, everything was going perfectly according to plan. And the purpose of the tabernacle and the sacrificial system and this worship before the Lord was being fulfilled. God's presence was there with his people. And it was as all should have been. But now we come to chapter 10. And the sin of Nadab and Abihu. Notice that in chapter 9, all references that we read to Aaron's sons were as a collective. They were always referred to collectively as Aaron's sons. But now, in chapter 10, Nadab and Abihu are singled out for their actions, which follow. Leviticus chapter 10, verse 1 and 2. And Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, took either of them his censer, and put fire therein, and put incense thereon, and offered strange fire before the Lord, which he commanded them not. And there went out fire from the Lord, and devoured them, and they died before the Lord. We're going to dissect those verses further when we answer our third question. Why did they die? But clearly, something in what Nadab and Abihu did greatly displeased the Lord. Now listen to what Moses tells his brother Aaron next, as Aaron's two eldest sons lie dead and smoldering in front of him. Verse 3, then Moses said unto Aaron, this is it that the Lord spake, saying, I will be sanctified in them that come nigh me. And before all the people I will be glorified. And Aaron held his peace. Imagine being Aaron in this moment. All the training, all the preparation, working with your sons. The glory of the Lord in that place. And then the shock of what he just witnessed. The realization setting in that, oh, the Lord was displeased and his two oldest sons were dead. How would you react in that moment? How might Aaron have reacted in that moment, if not for Moses interjecting a word from the Lord? Well, we have a clue at the end of that verse. Aaron was, I believe, was ready to cry out, reacting as a father. But confronted by the reality that he was still in the holy place, still dressed and anointed for service, he must act as the high priest of the people and not as the father of Nadab and Abihu. And the verse stated, and Aaron held his peace. It's a good thing, too. Because in the remaining verses of chapter 10, the bodies of Nadab and Abihu are removed by their cousins, and Aaron and his remaining sons are instructed not to mourn in that moment, or they too would die. And God's wrath would fall upon the whole people. So we've explored our second question. What were Nadab and Abihu doing that day in the tabernacle? And in our search of the scriptures, we found that they were serving alongside their father and their brothers in all the ritual sacrifices. They were presenting the blood of the animals. They were tending the fire. They were assisting in the burnt offerings. They were present there to witness the glory of the Lord and his pleasure at their faithful service. And yet, they also took their censers. And they took fire. And they took incense. And they offered strange fire. And tragically, they died before the Lord. So now let's look at our third question, which I think is pivotal in understanding the passage. Why did Nadab and Abihu die? We know what they did, but what was their offense that caused them to have to die? This is the central question, I think, for the whole portion. If we can answer this question, it will help to inform our answer to our final question of what we should take away, what we should learn. And I believe that if we look closely enough at the text, we will find the clues to answer the question, why did Nadab and Abihu die? We already read the first of those clues. It was Leviticus chapter 10, verse 3, when Moses spoke to Aaron immediately after the death of the two sons and caused Aaron to hold his peace. So let me read that verse again. Leviticus 10:3. Then Moses said unto Aaron, this is it that the Lord spake, saying, I will be sanctified in them that come nigh me. And before all the people, I will be glorified. And Aaron held his peace. Clearly, Moses is relaying something that the Lord spoke as an explanation of what had happened. And clearly, those words held such gravity in the moment for Aaron that they cut right through the shock and the emotion of the moment so that Aaron could immediately compose himself. The message to Aaron had two parts. First, I, the Lord, will be sanctified by those who come near me. And second, and before all the people, I, the Lord, will be glorified. Remember that to be sanctified is to be set apart, to be treated as different or special. It means to respect the holiness of God, not by treating him as something common. And who was authorized to come nearer to God than Moses and Aaron's sons? Remember also that the whole congregation of the people had gathered here, and all hearts had been focused in that moment on the glory of God. Nothing would be tolerated that would detract from or supersede God's glory as his people worshiped him. The timing of Moses' words and the effect that they had on Aaron make it clear that effectively he was saying, I was not sanctified by Nadab and Abihu who came near me. And I was not glorified by what Nadab and Abihu did before all the people. So based on our first clue in that verse, we see that Nadab and Abihu's offense was a failure to sanctify and glorify the Lord. But that's not it. The second clue we can turn to is the way that Nadab and Abihu are referred to later in the Torah, not in this portion, and not in the book of Leviticus. But later, after their death, there are references to Nadab and Abihu. And it's in the book of Numbers. The first one is in Numbers chapter 3, verses 2 through 4. And these are the names of the sons of Aaron, Nadab the firstborn, and Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar. These are the names of the sons of Aaron, the priests, which were anointed, whom he consecrated to minister in the priest's office. And Nadab and Abihu died before the Lord when they offered strange fire before the Lord in the wilderness of Sinai. And they had no children. And Eleazar and Ithamar ministered in the priest's office in the sight of Aaron, their father. There's a similar reference later in Numbers, chapter 26, verses 60 and 61. Numbers 26, 60 and 61. And unto Aaron was born Nadab and Abihu, Eleazar and Ithamar. And Nadab and Abihu died when they offered strange fire before the Lord. Neither of these passages is directly about Nadab and Abihu. They are just referred to in these passages. Both were part of longer passages describing lineages of people. But in both cases, Moses, the author of the Torah, took the time, made the effort to remind us, the reader, of the circumstances of their death. So let me put it this way. If the key observation had been that they died while serving, then Moses could have emphasized that by saying in those Numbers passages, Nadab and Abihu who died in the tabernacle. If the key observation was that Nadab and Abihu were intoxicated on the day that they died, and some have concluded that that's the explanation because of another verse that appears in Leviticus 10. If that was the key observation, then Moses could have emphasized that by saying Nadab and Abihu who died when they drank strong drink in the tabernacle. But look again at how they were memorialized in both passages from Numbers. Both specify that Nadab and Abihu died when they offered strange fire before the Lord. That was the purposeful emphasis around their death. They offered strange fire. This phrase, Esh Zerah, strange fire, becomes key to understanding what was happening in the tabernacle that day. So let's go back again one more time and reread Leviticus chapter 10, verse 1. Just that first verse. Leviticus 10:1. And Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, took either of them his censer, and put fire therein, and put incense thereon, and offered strange fire, Esh Zerah, before the Lord, which he commanded them not. What exactly was this strange fire? Again, we'll go to the text for the answer. Remember that the instructions for the design and the use of all the articles, all the furniture in the tabernacle, all of those instructions were given in the book of Exodus. And in Exodus 30, verse 9, we find a similar phrase that was part of those instructions regarding the golden altar of incense. And here's what it says, Exodus 30, verse 9. You shall offer no strange incense thereon, nor burnt sacrifice, nor meat offering, neither shall ye pour drink offering thereon. So let me pause for a second and just to avoid any possible confusion here, and remind you that there were two altars present in the tabernacle. Two different altars, very distinct from one another. The outer altar was made of bronze. The bronze altar, also known as the brazen altar, the altar of the burnt offerings. This was the altar that Aaron and his sons were using all throughout Leviticus 9 when we read through all of those sacrifices. They were at that outer altar making the burnt offerings. But if you move past that altar and past the laver full of water that was used to ritually wash the hands and the feet, the priests could enter through a curtain into the holy place, which housed the lampstand on one side and the table of showbread on the other side, and the second altar, the golden altar of incense, which was just before the veil to the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant was, with its mercy seat and the cherubim. Exodus 30, verse 9, is part of the passage giving all the instructions for that inner altar, the golden altar of incense, not that outer one. Incense, according to Exodus 30, was to be burned on the golden altar continually, with new incense offered every morning and every evening, at the same time as the evening lighting of the lampstand and the morning trimming of the lamps. And according to this verse, no other type of offering could be made on this altar, the altar of incense. It was only for the offering of the incense, and only a very specific blend of incense could ever be used. So the use of the altar was limited to the incense, and the incense itself was very precisely prescribed. In fact, an offender of this, or one making and using a foreign incense, would be cut off from the people. So the command here is to not offer any strange or foreign incense. Let's look one more time at Leviticus 10:1 and see how those verses and what happened with Nadab and Abihu relate to each other. Leviticus 10:1, and Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, took either of them his censer, and put fire therein, and put incense thereon, and offered strange fire before the Lord, which he commanded them not. Notice what tabernacle articles Nadab and Abihu used in this verse: censers, fire, and incense. These items would only be used together at the inner golden altar. And yet the context of the larger passage we read in Leviticus seems to place them with their father at the bronze altar, where no incense was prescribed for any of the daily sacrifices burned there. The verse doesn't explicitly state which altar Nadab and Abihu sinned at. But if it was the outer bronze altar, then they would be in violation for the regulations of how to make the sacrifices at that altar. But if, on the other hand, they were at the inner golden altar of incense inside the holy place, well, then there's multiple problems. First, the strange fire would seem to indicate they may have used strange incense, which was forbidden. Second, it was not the prescribed time for the burning of incense, which was morning and evening at the time of the lampstand attendance. Either way, at either altar, it is clear that Nadab and Abihu were disobedient to the very precise instructions for the tabernacle service. The deaths of Nadab and Abihu clearly stemmed from disobeying God's instructions. Whether they did so in ignorance, whether they did so in a prideful disregard for God's ways, whether they thought they knew better, or were just exuberant to do something magical before the people, they disobeyed and they paid for that disobedience with their lives. So let's come back again and summarize what we found for our third question. Why did Nadab and Abihu die, and what was their offense? We have examined the clues in the text, and we found that Nadab and Abihu did not carry out their priestly duties in strict adherence to God's instructions. And by choosing their own way over his, for whatever reason, they failed to sanctify God, the sovereign one, and rather than glorify him in front of all the people, they brought dishonor on God. In short, their disobedience treated God as common rather than as holy, as not worthy of being obeyed. So now our fourth question. What can we learn from Nadab and Abihu about the character of God and about the character of man? When you consider this week's Torah portion, Shemini, I hope you will see that one of the undeniable and unmistakable attributes of God is his holiness. He is not at all to be treated as commonplace. And yet, when we choose our own way over his way, then we show that we either don't care enough to learn what pleases him, or we don't care enough to submit to that which pleases him. We choose ourselves instead. Obedience is a key element of sanctifying the Lord and glorifying him in front of others. When we live in obedience to God's law, we act as though he is the king and we are his subject, not the other way around. It is a way of showing outwardly the devotion to him that we have inwardly. And it is the heart of the child that our Father is really after. That heart of obedience. Listen to what Samuel says to Saul when Saul disobeyed the Lord. This is in 1 Samuel 15. So Samuel said, "Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams." I think too often we fail to obey because we lack faith. I told Nathan before the service started that I was going to quote one of my favorite ancient Jewish sages near the end of the message. So here we are. And I wouldn't tell him which one it was. So I hope you're all familiar with the ancient rabbi, Mr. Miyagi, from Karate Kid. There was Danielson. Danielson was desperate to learn karate from the master Miyagi. But he was frustrated. Why? Because all he did all day long was wax cars and paint fences and paint the house and sand the fence, sand the deck. Remember that? Danielson's attitude was terrible, and he struggled with the seemingly pointless and arbitrary chores that he was given day in and day out. But it was after Danielson finally relented and chose to trust his master that he came to see that he had actually been learning karate all along. We should not obey the Lord only when the command makes sense to us or when we can see the whole path right from the beginning. Rather, we should obey because he is the Lord and his will is best, regardless of our understanding. We should obey because it is a form of worship and because he is sanctified and glorified when his people obey him. What does the story of Nadab and Abihu teach us about our own character? The two sons that disobeyed found death. The two sons that obeyed, Eleazar and Ithamar, they went on to serve God for many, many more years. Eleazar followed in his father's footsteps to be the high priest. No matter how strong, no matter how smart, no matter how determined any of us is, this is true about our character. We will always serve something. None of us can truly be our own master. And if we think we can, we are fools. Paul says it like this in Romans. Romans chapter 6, verses 16 through 18. Do you not know that to whom you present yourselves slaves to obey, you are that one's slaves whom you obey, whether of sin leading to death or of obedience leading to righteousness? And our Messiah, Yeshua, said this in Matthew 24, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. In answering our fourth question, we see that God is holy, and he is full of glory, and his ways are perfect, and to obey him is to submit ourselves to his will. And to disobey him is to submit ourselves ultimately unto death. We must choose to serve and obey our God. And it's not just because it brings us life and blessing, but because it develops and demonstrates the devotion that he deserves. He is the Lord Most High. All honor and glory are his, and he is glorified through the obedience of his people. May we all choose obedience, leading to righteousness. May the strange fire of Nadab and Abihu always be far from our hearts. And may we instead burn with a holy fire of obedience